of the violin, the transference of ideas through sound and craftsmanship by Kirby Carlson. By examining the driving forces of famous craftsmen, the impact and evolution of related technology, I'm going to argue today that the violin has significantly influenced the world through the spread of ideas from maker to musician to audience by offering a non-verbal method of communication. Since the violin was created around 1520, the exact date is unknown. Surviving records can be understandably vague, contradictory, or simply not exist entirely. While many details about the history of the violin have been lost due to both time and the fact that the writers of that time were uninterested in recording facts about the subject, there are some theories about where the instrument originated and who was responsible for creating it. Many sources are in conflict about who could have made it and who couldn't have, which leads to contradictions in this list of disproven and possibilities in regards to inventors. Since many of the men from either category came from Brescia, Italy, this isn't most likely where the violin originated from, but based on my research, that's what I'm going to say. It's where it came from. Brescia was established in around 200 BC and was the wealthiest city in the region, and it was in what is today northern Italy. During the 16th century. Also around this time, it switched from Venetian to French rule, mostly to differences of culture. Brescia never fully recovered from a sacking, which was ironically committed by a Frenchman during this time period. The biggest influence on the violin and its invention was Brescia's wealth. Because more people had money to burn, more entertainers were needed, which includes musicians. Another factor is that Brescia was under French rule during this time period, and the violin is descended, and I say descended in a loose term because there's no clear pathway to the invention of the violin, but it's pretty obvious by simply looking at this instrument, and it's called the rebec. By looking at the rebec, it's obvious that they're somewhat related because they have the same general shape. And the rebec is important because it was sometimes used during royal weddings in France, and because Brescia was under the French's rule during this time, it makes sense that they would feel like this instrument was more important. The violin, therefore, allowed the communication of both Brescia's wealth and its allegiance to France instead of Venice to be portrayed without words. An important person in the invention in regards to the violin is Antonio Stradivari. Antonio Stradivari is probably one of the more famous violin craftsmen, and many would argue that his instruments are among the best. There's no known portrait of Stradivari, but here are some guesses at what he might have looked like. Antonio Stradivari was born around 1644, and the only reason we know that is because he had an inscription in one of his later instruments, and it said that it was made around when he was 90, and so historians just subtracted his age from the date that the violin was made and came up with 1644. He married Francesca Ferraboschi in Cremona in 1667. An interesting fact about Francesca is that she was a widower, and her first husband was killed after only 2 years of marriage by her own brother, and the reasons for him committing that homicide are unclear, but it's just an interesting fact. It's not really important to Stradivari. Francesca died in 1698, And then shortly thereafter, Stradivari married Antonia Zambelli, who was quite a bit younger than him. He was around 54, and she was 35 when they wed. Stradivari had lots of children. He had 9 children who survived to adulthood. Francesco Amobono, Giovanni Battista, and Paolo all worked as luthieres, same as under Stradivari. Giovanni was the first son of his second marriage, and he was particularly dear to Stradivari, but he died at 23, and this made Antonio have a premature gravestone in which he carved 1729, the year Giovanni Battisti died, into a gravestone with his own name and said that he died then. But he really died 8 years after that, in year 1737. As for who mentored Antonio Stradivari, it's very unclear. Like, it's likely that Stradivari was a woodcrafter, a woodcutter. Well, not exactly a woodcutter, but he was likely just a woodcarver. And there was an inscription in one of his instruments that implied that he mentored underneath Niccolo Amati, but there is really no evidence that supports that. So we're not really sure who mentored him. By looking at several of his instruments, they're called Strads for short, Stradivarius violins, you can just see the amount of detail and craftsmanship that he put into each of them. The Cyprian potter was created in 1683, and it's beautiful. You can see the detailed inlay work on the scroll, which is the fancy tip with where the strings go in, and then just the body of the violin is also very detailed. The Messiah, completed in 1716, is widely reputed to be his best work, and it actually is controversial because some experts don't even think Messiah was created by Stradivari. So that leads up to the second best and most well preserved of Stradivari's today is the instrument Lady Blunt, and was completed in 1721 during Stradivarius' golden years. As for if their actually sound quality is better than any others, I'll let you decide for yourself. This is a short video that is it's a sound comparison between a modern day violin and a Strad. And at this point, it would be better for you to just watch it on your own computer because the sound wouldn't carry over well during this video. So please go watch that on your own. Through his instruments, Antonio Stradivari inspired controversy, debate, and musicians for centuries, and he continues to do so without ever saying a word. The invention of the violin led to the creation of orchestras and symphonies, and that's had a major impact on economies. In the United States alone, there are more than 1,200 symphony orchestras that generate almost $1 billion yearly in revenue. Collectively, they employ 11,000 administrators and 78,000 musicians. These orchestras perform annually for 32 million people, making this a large section of the service and entertainment sector. Returning for a moment to the Lady Blunt, of the Antonio Stradivarius's violin. It was auctioned off in two. Lady Blunt was able to have more of an impact than most instruments are able to. In 2011, a devastating tsunami hit Japan. This disaster led to the need for aid from all sources and also inspired charity on the part of many, including the Nippon Music Foundation. This foundation owned Lady Blunt from 2008 to 2011, where, after the tsunami happened, it decided to sell the famed instrument and donate the funds to the relief effort. At the auction, Lady Blunt sold for nearly $16 million US. This is still the largest amount any single violin has sold for to date. The instrument of music became an instrument of action itself without a violinist playing, due to this generous, self-serving contribution by whoever bought this amazing instrument. That was also an unintended consequences for Antonio Stradivari. I'm not sure he realized that his instruments would later be sold for charity, which is interesting. Leading with more unintended consequences, violins can't really be played without a bow now, and every violin bow needs hair to string it on, and the most common hair used is horsehair. And while some is harvested from live animals, which brings up the question of if it's humane to hack off an animal's hair, most of it comes from slaughtered animals. This causes another question to be asked. Are some horses only being killed to supply hair for bows? And if that's true, what can we do about it? I found information stating that most hair comes from slaughtered animals. I didn't find any information stating on how many that might be, or how often horses die, and stuff like that. Another unintended consequence of a violin is wood poaching. When you hear the word poaching, most people think of like animal poaching, like they're poaching elephants or poaching lions, but apparently you can poach trees too, which I didn't know before researching this. But the best wood to make violins are from really old trees. The older the tree, the better the sound is. And most really old trees, like the redwoods and the sequoias, are protected by laws now. And while most luthiers do not condone these actions, poached wood still ends up in violin instruments simply because you can't obtain it by legal methods. And wood poaching is a felony, and the fact of the matter is, because the best instruments come from really old trees, there will probably always be a demand for poached wood because you can't obtain said trees through legal methods. Speaking of legalities, patents are a legal form of protection for people who create something. And one such patent exists for something called a violin support, more commonly known as a shoulder rest. And it was created by, it was perfected by Joseph Kahn, but he wasn't the first one to have this idea. But Kahn is the most important and probably the most famous. If you ask a violinist if they know who Kahn is, they won't say they know who he is, but they'll probably say, I have a Kahn shoulder rest. The rest of the evolution of the technology of violin is rather complex. With just the bow that uses play, there are three main types of bow I'm going to talk about. There are like literally hundreds of others because it took centuries for the modern day bow called the tort bow to actually be created. It was created in 1750, the second half of the 18th century, and the violin was created in 1520, so that's 2 centuries about of what are they going to do for bows. But Francis Tort standardized the modern day bow to a length of 29.5 inches. The bow head on a Tort bow is heavier than previous models, and he also had to load the bottom of the frog with more weight so it would balance out correctly. Another bow, the Stradivari bow, was actually created like 50 years before Tort invented his bow, and Antonio Stradivari just keeps coming back because he's one of the greats. And it's a little bit shorter than the Tort bow, but it's also lighter, and modern day violinists have been able to create more technically demanding bowings than they could with a modern day bow, simply because it's lighter and shorter. The last bow I'm going to talk about is the Bach bow. And the Bach bow is interesting because it has a convex of 4 to 5 inches. As you can see, it's really big. And it's adjusted, the hair is adjusted, it has a lever, and it's adjustable to make it looser or tighter with a player's thumb. And because of this, as you loosen it or tighten it, you can play either all of the strings at once, a couple of the strings at once only, or one of the strings at once. And it allows for chords to be played when normally it's not possible. Antonio Stradivari, along with creating this bow, he also experimented with the sound boxes, which is what makes violins sound the way they do, and the length of the violin, which also contributes to the sound they make. And while some of his longer models weren't successful, he eventually started hovering around modern day lengths of the violin. Due to this constant process of evolution of the violin and its accessories, it highlights the need many feel to protect the instrument and its music and make the messages played on them even clearer. The violin is an instrument of music, but more important than that, it is an instrument of change. Its history is rooted in experimentation for centuries before the modern-day standards were set. Craftsmen have toiled for hours to produce quality instruments for musicians. Millions of people have paid billions of dollars in the past to see skilled professionals as they make violins speak during concerts. A single person paid millions for a single instrument that allowed for a significantly positive impact on a society devastated by a natural disaster. The violin has significantly influenced the world through the spread of ideas from maker to musician to audience by offering a nonverbal method of communication. As the famous author Victor Hugo said, "Music expresses that which cannot be put into words, and that which cannot remain silent." The violin creates music and is just as important as its intangible product. Here are my sources. I hope you enjoyed my presentation.